The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. That is what the entire Wintervale pack had gathered to witness beneath the vaulted frost-rimmed ceilings of the Great Hall. The ancient stone fortress, carved directly into the side of the freezing mountain, had stood for centuries as a monument to brutal strength and unforgiving hierarchy. Tonight it served as a grand theater for public humiliation. The air inside the cavernous space was thick and heavy. It suffocated with the scent of damp wool, burning pine from the massive hearths, and the collective cruel anticipation of 500 wolves. The ancient murals depicting the first shapeshifters hunting under a blood moon were barely visible through the centuries of soot and shadow. They watched silently as the modern pack gathered for a spectacle of betrayal. The wolves stood shoulder to shoulder in the flickering, uneven torchlight, their breath plumed in the freezing draft that leaked through the high iron windows. They were waiting for the exact moment a heart shattered into 1,000 irreparable pieces. Raymond Thorne stood upon the raised stone dais, his broad shoulders draped in the thick ceremonial black pelts of his predecessors. The Alpha of Wintervale possessed a sharp, handsome face, though it was currently twisted by an arrogant, triumphant smirk. He looked down at the crowd with the absolute certainty of a man who believed he owned the entire world and everything walking upon it. Between his thick, calloused fingers, he held the ultimate symbol of female authority within their regional borders, the lunar ring, a heavy silver band set with a raw moonstone, symbolizing the female pack leader's authority. By all the sacred primal laws of the moon goddess, that ring belonged to his fated mate. It belonged to Sienna. But a mate bond was merely an inconvenience to a man who craved superficial dominance over true grounding loyalty. Raymond did not want a quiet, unremarkable Omega, whose strength lay in silent endurance rather than flashy displays of aggressive power. He viewed her quiet dignity as a fatal weakness. To him, an Omega without blind submission was an abomination. He wanted a political trophy. He wanted absolute compliance wrapped in a beautiful, boastful package that he could show off to the neighboring territories. And he had found exactly what he was looking for. Standing directly beside the Alpha, radiating a venomous level of smug satisfaction, was Clara Vance, Sienna's own sister. She was draped in cascading layers of white silk that pooled around her feet like spilled milk. It was a stark, deliberate contrast to the dark, utilitarian clothing worn by the rest of the pack. She radiated a cloying, artificially sweet perfume of crushed lilies and rosewater, a desperate attempt to mask the underlying scent of her own ruthless ambition. Her golden hair was intricately braided with red frostberries. She demanded the attention of every eye in the room. Clear's throat. She looked down at the assembled crowd with the haughty superiority of a queen who had already won a bloody war. In the very front row, separated from the raised platform by only a few feet of cracked stone, Sienna watched them. She wore no silk. She was veiled in dark charcoal wool that absorbed the shadows, buttoned tight from her waist all the way up to her wrists. Most notably, a stiff, high-lace collar wrapped securely around her throat, reaching up to the very hinge of her jaw. The delicate white threads of the lace meticulously hid the fragile skin of her neck and collarbone from the prying, judgmental eyes of the pack. She kept her hands folded neatly in front of her. Her posture remained perfectly straight. Her expression was an impenetrable mask. The crowd leaned forward, practically vibrating with vicious excitement. Whispers cascaded through the hall like falling gravel, sharp and grating against the cold stone walls. They pitied the discarded Omega. They mocked her invisible, pathetic misery. Everyone in that room expected her to weep, to fall to her trembling knees, to beg the arrogant ruler for a sliver of mercy, or a dark corner of the pack house to live out her remaining days in shame and atonement. She did none of those things. Raymond stepped toward Clara, his chest puffed with pride. He lifted her slender, eager hand for the entire hall to see. With a theatrical flourish deliberately meant to maximize the public humiliation of the true mate standing below. He raised his voice. "I reject this bond." 4 words. That was all it took to sever the sacred tie. He slid the lunar rings onto Clara's finger. The raw moonstone caught the torchlight, flashing with a cold, dead luminescence. The act was final. The ultimate betrayal performed in front of hundreds of witnesses. When the ring locked into place, Sienna felt the primal snap. It was a vicious, tearing sensation right behind her ribs. A phantom claw ripping out a connection that had been dormant, but undeniably present since childhood. The breath left her lungs in a sharp rush. Her fingers turned to ice. For one terrifying fraction of a second, the void threatened to swallow her whole. But then, a strange, terrifying, and glorious sensation began to bloom directly beneath the tight restriction of her high lace collar. Heat. It started as a spark, a microscopic ember buried deep in her flesh where a faint healing scar had rested in absolute secrecy for the past 3 weeks. Now, triggered by the official severing of her lesser regional bond, the ancient magic awakened with a vengeance. The heat spread rapidly across her collarbone, radiating a fierce golden warmth that completely eradicated the bitter chill of the Great Hall. It was the sovereign mark, a golden, burning, claiming mark etched onto the collarbone signifying the mate of the High King. It thrummed with raw, possessive energy that made her pulse race with sudden, overwhelming life. The pack thought she was freezing in her pathetic isolation. They didn't know she was already consumed by a fire they could not possibly comprehend. Profound stillness reigned in the massive cavern of the packhouse. The irreversible deed was done. The crowd held its collective breath, hundreds of eyes shifting eagerly from the triumphant, silk-draped couple on the dais to the solitary figure in dark wool standing below. Elder Corvin, the rigid priest, who had presided over the ceremony with a face carved from stone, frowned at the unnatural quiet of the discarded female. He gripped his wooden ceremonial staff, his knuckles white, sensing a dangerous disruption in the ancient rites. They waited for the inevitable tears to spill over her pale cheeks. Sienna blinked. The golden heat beneath her collar flared violently, sending a rush of absolute crystalline clarity through her veins. The invisible wall inside her chest, where the old unwanted bond had festered, suddenly crumbled to dust, leaving nothing but clean, echoing space. She felt incredibly light, untethered from their petty cruelty. The burning thread on her skin acted as an impenetrable shield against the psychic weight of the pack's collective mockery. It anchored her to something so vast and powerful that this local drama suddenly felt entirely meaningless. Deliberately, the quiet Omega took a single step back from the stone dais, and then, defying every expectation in the room, she smiled. It was not a hysterical grin born of madness. It was not a brittle mask of forced bravery. It was a genuine, serene curve of her lips, soft and utterly devastating in its pure, untouchable indifference. The warmth radiating from her marked flesh brought a flush of healthy, vibrant color to her face. Raymond's smirk faltered immediately. He stared down at the female he had just proudly discarded, his brow furrowing in deep, sudden confusion. His inner beast did not just pace. It threw itself against the bars of his consciousness, bristling with inexplicable dread. An alpha wolf operates on clear hierarchies of submission or challenge. The Omega's serene smile offered neither. It offered absolute irrelevance. "Thank you," Sienna whispered. Her voice was barely a breeze. Yet in the total suffocating silence of the hall, it carried straight to the dais with terrifying precision. The 2 words hit him like physical stones thrown in the dark. Raymond stiffened, his jaw clenching so tight a muscle ticked rapidly in his cheek. He expected pleading. Watching her smile and express genuine gratitude twisted a knot of bizarre, icy panic deep in his gut. Ignorance might excuse an accidental slight, but a willful betrayal leaves no room for absolution. The Alpha had made his choice, standing before the altar of his ancestors, thinking he was simply discarding a useless piece of property. He had absolutely no idea what he had actually set free. Beside him, Clara completely misread the heavy tension radiating from her new mate. The newly crowned Luna thrust her chin upward, lifting her left hand high. She desperately wanted the adoration. "Behold your Luna!" a guard shouted from the front ranks. The murmurs erupted into a ragged, deafening cheer. The pack members began to howl, a chaotic, ear-splitting symphony of submission. Clara laughed, leaning her weight into Raymond's rigid side. She looked down at her sister, her eyes glittering with malicious glee. Sienna remained entirely unbothered. The noise washed over her like water over a smooth, unyielding stone. She raised a delicate, trembling hand and gently rested her fingertips against the edge of the intricate fabric at her throat. The fabric itself was hot to the touch. The sovereign mark was practically singing against her skin, a molten golden thread binding her soul to a man who commanded entire legions. Let them have their cheap silver ring. Let them have their frozen, isolated territory. She tuned out the howling crowd, closing her silver-gray eyes for a brief, stolen second. The memory flooded her senses. It pulled her violently away from the stench of damp fur and betrayal, dragging her backward into a blinding blizzard where her true destiny had been written in blood and ice. The intense physical heat of the hidden mark anchored her to a desperate night exactly 3 weeks ago. The whispering woods had been completely swallowed by an unnatural, punishing winter storm. The wind tore through the towering pines with the force of a physical blow, snapping thick branches like dry twigs. The snow fell so fast it blinded the eyes. It was a night where the cold simply stopped hearts in their chests. But Sienna had run. Forced out of the pack house by Clara's relentless taunting, she had fled into the treacherous tree line with nothing but a thin woolen cloak. She had dragged her boots through snowdrifts that reached her thighs. The cold had seeped directly into her marrow, turning her breath into shards of ice. She had been wandering blindly, looking for a quiet, hidden patch of snow to numb the endless ache of being entirely unwanted. Instead, she found the blood. It had been a stark, violent splash of crimson against the pristine snowdrifts. Driven by an instinct she did not understand, Sienna followed the heavy trail of red. Deep within a shadowed ravine, sheltered slightly by the massive roots of a dead oak tree, she had found the traveler. He was a literal mountain of a man, collapsed heavily on his side in the deep snow. He possessed broad, imposing shoulders, wrapped in shredded dark iron-gray leather. A thick cloak, soaked entirely through with black blood. In the dim light, Sienna could see the intricate silver thread embroidery of roaring beasts across his breastplate. Deep, jagged lacerations tore through his side and chest. Sienna had frozen. Her survival instinct screamed at her to turn around and run. The man radiated a lethal, predatory danger. Then he moved. A low, rumbling groan vibrated from his deep chest. Agonizingly, the massive stranger turned his head toward the small figure standing in the storm. His eyes fluttered open. Sienna's breath caught painfully in her throat. They were molten gold, not the dull, common amber of a regional wolf, but the blinding, ancient gold of a sun trapped in ancient ice. Clouded by unimaginable pain, those eyes pinned her to the spot, grabbing her bare soul with an invisible iron grip. He was freezing to death. He had no pack here to save him, no royal guards to carry him to safety. He was completely, utterly alone in the crushing dark. Sienna knew exactly what it meant to be alone in the dark. Without a single second thought for her own safety, she had fallen to her knees in the deep snow beside him. Her trembling hands reached out, urgently brushing the freezing snow from his pale face. He was terrifyingly cold. The life was rapidly draining from his monumental frame. She crawled into the cramped, freezing hollow beside him. She pressed her fragile body entirely against his massive, bleeding frame, wrapping her thin woolen cloak over them both. The dying man convulsed violently at the sudden contact, a feral growl vibrating deep in his throat. His large hand weakly twitched, lifting as if to blindly push her away. She didn't retreat. She pressed closer, burying her freezing face into the curve of his neck, breathing in the overwhelming scent of sharp cedarwood, metallic blood, and wild winter storms. Her fingers tangled in his dark hair, holding him steady. "I would rather burn with you than freeze alone," she whispered fiercely into the freezing dark, pouring every ounce of her own stubborn resilience into the stranger. The storm raged with a violence that felt almost entirely sentient, as if the frozen mountain itself was actively trying to bury the secret hidden beneath the tangled roots and ends of the dead oak tree. The freezing air inside the cramped, shadowy hollow shifted subtly. The massive injured man, hovering dangerously on the absolute brink of death, suddenly stopped his weak, instinctual resistance. He did not violently push her away into the deadly, suffocating snowdrift. Instead, his heavy, blood-stained fingers twitched erratically against the coarse charcoal wool of her thin winter cloak. Slowly, agonizingly, his massive hand curled inward, gripping the cheap fabric with a sudden, terrifying surge of raw strength. He pulled her tighter against the solid, unyielding wall of his heavily armored chest. She gasped softly as the sheer, overwhelming weight of his physical presence enveloped her entirely. He breathed in deeply, his pale face baring itself completely into the delicate, vulnerable crook of her neck. The metallic, bitter tang of spilled blood mingled instantly with the sudden, intoxicating scent of crushed pine needles, ancient earth, and wild winter storms. It was an overwhelming, dominant fragrance that completely bypassed her logical, terrified mind and spoke directly to the dormant, suppressed wolf resting deep within her soul. The cold ceased to exist in the small space between their bodies, replaced by a strange magnetic friction that defied the freezing temperature of the brutal blizzard. His golden eyes opened again. They pierced the heavy, suffocating gloom of the dark ravine with a terrifying, absolute clarity. The blinding, cloudy pain that had previously obscured his vision was entirely gone, replaced by the razor-sharp, lethal focus of an apex predator actively identifying its true north. He did not see a discarded, wolfless outcast trembling helplessly in the brutal snow. He did not see the pathetic, weak creature her regional pack arrogantly believed her to be. He saw exactly who she was. He saw the quiet, unbreakable iron resting just beneath her fragile skin. Clear's throat. With a low, rumbling exhale that sent an involuntary, powerful shiver down the entire length of her spine, the stranger shifted his heavy jaw. He moved with the deliberate, unstoppable, fluid grace of a falling avalanche. He pressed his cold, cracked lips directly against the rapid pulse point of her bare collarbone. It was not a kiss of gratitude. It was a brand. A sudden blinding heat erupted violently upon the surface of her skin. She arched her back, a sharp, breathless sound escaping her parted lips as the golden fire seared ruthlessly into her tender flesh. It sank past the dermal layers, burning through bone and sinew, to anchor itself permanently onto the very fabric of her identity. The bond snapped into place like a key turning in a lock. It was a vicious, agonizing physiological sensation, yet it felt perfectly, undeniably right. The molten warmth rapidly replaced the icy blood in her veins, rewriting her biological destiny in a matter of crucial stolen seconds. As the glowing, intricate lines of the claiming mark violently etched themselves into her body, the colossal man pulled back just a fraction of an inch to hold her wide, shocked gaze. The ambient light in the dark hollow seemed to physically bend and warp around the radiant heat radiating from his mesmerizing irises. "Not used, not owned, chosen," Valerius whispered into the frigid air. His voice was a gravelly, deeply resonant vow that effortlessly overpowered the screaming, chaotic wind of the blizzard outside. It was a royal decree, spoken in the dark, binding two completely different worlds together, with an unbreakable thread of ancient, sovereign magic. He reached up, his rough, heavily scarred thumb gently brushing a stray snowflake from her trembling lower lip. The physical touch was impossibly tender for a towering creature built entirely for the brutal realities of war. Before the terrified girl could even begin to comprehend the monumental magnitude of what had just irrevocably altered her entire existence, the distant thunderous sound of heavy hooves violently shattered their isolated sanctuary. Torches flared a brilliant, angry orange through the blinding, impenetrable curtain of white snow. Frantic, commanding shouts from heavily armored royal guards echoed sharply through the narrow ravine, their deep voices thick with raw panic as they desperately searched the tree line for their fallen sovereign. The traveler's iron grip on her slender waist tightened fiercely. For one fleeting, desperate second, his intensely possessive hold threatened to drag her out into the harsh torchlight with him. But the survival of his sprawling kingdom required his immediate, uninterrupted return. And dragging a vulnerable, unmarked female into a heavily armed, chaotic extraction party was a fatal tactical risk. He released her slowly, his glowing eyes promising a terrifying return that defied the very laws of nature. The memory dissolved like pale ash scattered in the wind. The blinding, pristine white of the snowy woods abruptly shifted back to the oppressive, soot-stained, claustrophobic reality of the Great Hall. The deafening, chaotic cheers of the Wintervale pack slowly faded into a low, buzzing, expectant murmur that vibrated unpleasantly against the cold, damp stone walls. The grand theater of public humiliation had reached its final procedural stage. Standing high upon the raised wooden dais, Elder Corvin lifted his heavily carved ceremonial staff. The ancient priest's weathered face was a roadmap of rigid tradition and unyielding dogmatic judgment. He struck the heavy base of the wood fiercely against the solid stone floor. The sharp, cracking echo ricocheted loudly off the vaulted ceilings, instantly silencing the remaining chatter of the gathered wolves. The official conclusion of the mating rite had been formally acknowledged by the silent spirits of their ancestors. The brutal deed was irreversibly sealed in the eyes of their sacred, unbending laws. Raymond stepped forward. He deliberately moved away from his newly crowned bride, closing the physical distance between himself and the very edge of the stone platform. He looked down at his former mate with a cold, meticulously hardened expression of absolute authority. He desperately wanted to see her crumble into a pathetic, weeping, broken mess upon the floorboards. Her serene, completely unbothered smile had deeply unsettled his inner beast, striking a bizarre, dissonant chord of pure primal panic that he could not logically explain away. An alpha's absolute power relied entirely on the highly visible, unquestioning submission of his lesser subjects. Her quiet dignity was an active, breathing, dangerous insult to his newly solidified political position. He needed to reassert his total dominance over the quiet female he had just so proudly rejected in front of hundreds. By the sacred, blood-bound laws of our founding ancestors, you are no longer recognized as a ranking member of this territory, the Alpha declared loudly. His booming voice echoed harshly off the high, frost-rimmed iron windows. He raised his broad chin, delivering the carefully constructed banishment decree with practiced, highly theatrical cruelty. Every single deliberate syllable was designed to permanently strip away the last remaining fragile shreds of her basic dignity. You are hereby completely stripped of all pack privileges, all territorial protections, and all inherent rights associated with the elite bloodline, he continued, his tone dripping with acidic, heavy condescension. You will immediately vacate the upper chambers of this fortress. You will move your pathetic belongings to the servant quarters in the deepest, coldest levels of the keep before the midnight toll. Furthermore, your first official duty as an unranked expendable laborer will be to clean the remnants of our grand wedding feast. The crowd snickered softly in the heavy shifting shadows of the hall. A cruel collective wave of dark amusement rippled rapidly through the gathered ranks of the pack. They nudged each other with sharp elbows, their eyes glittering with the ugly, intoxicating thrill of witnessing a highborn female fall so disastrously from grace. They waited eagerly for the crushing absolute weight of the public humiliation to finally snap her fragile spirit in half. They desperately wanted her to fall to her bruised knees and beg pitifully for a tiny scrap of the mercy she no longer deserved. Sienna merely bowed her head in a slow, perfectly measured, entirely respectful nod. The internal barricades she had maintained for years were no longer necessary. Let the foolish man speak his arrogant, empty decrees from a temporary, unstable throne of stolen wood and stone. Let him boast endlessly to a room full of weak sycophants who would turn on him the second a truly stronger predator entered the territory. Let him firmly, blindly believe he had successfully cast her down into the filthy dirt of the lowest possible caste. He was entirely, blissfully unaware that an untouchable king had already carved her name into the very stars above their ignorant heads. The intense, protective heat pulsing heavily beneath the delicate lace at her throat was the only reality that actually mattered now. The grand historical feast had quickly devolved into exactly what she knew it would ultimately become: a chaotic, gluttonous, aggressively drunken celebration. The Clear's throat, massive wooden banquet tables that lined the extensive length of the hall were heavily stained with spilled dark wine, congealing grease from roasted meats, and the careless, disgusting debris of a pack celebrating their own manufactured fragile superiority. Hours later, the massive fortress was mostly empty. The roaring, massive fires in the giant stone hearths had slowly died down to weak, flickering orange embers that barely cast enough light to safely navigate the floorboards. The freezing mountain draft crept back into the vast, cavernous room, chilling the stagnant, foul-smelling air. In the dead center of the devastation, a solitary, quiet figure moved gracefully through the shadows, meticulously sweeping the horrific mess left behind by her own cruel people. The outcast worked in total, undisturbed, absolute silence. Her dark, heavy wool dress rustled softly against the rough stone as she knelt carefully to gather the ruined, scattered remnants of her sister's stolen triumph. Her fragile knees ached fiercely against the unforgiving rock, and her small hands were already rubbed raw from hauling heavy, freezing wooden buckets of water from the courtyard well. But her metallic irises remained perfectly, impossibly still. She did not shed a single pathetic tear into the dirty scrub water. Footsteps echoed sharply against the cold, empty floorboards. The rhythmic, highly arrogant clicking of hard heels announced the sudden arrival of the victor. Clara appeared from the deep pitch-black shadows of the grand arched doorway. The new Luna was still wearing her pristine, ridiculously expensive white silk gown, though the delicate fabric was now slightly rumpled and heavily stained with dark wine around the trailing, sweeping hem. She carried a towering, highly precarious stack of dirty, grease-smeared porcelain plates and half-empty, sticky crystal goblets. A venomous, highly self-satisfied smirk played visibly upon her perfectly painted lips as she confidently crossed the vast room and stopped directly in front of the kneeling servant. "You missed a spot right here," the blonde woman sneered, her high voice echoing shrilly in the empty cavern. Without a single word of genuine warning, she deliberately tilted her delicate wrists forward. The heavy stacked porcelain crashed violently onto the solid stone floor, mere inches from the kneeling girl's bruised legs. The expensive ceramic shattered instantly into 100 jagged, razor-sharp shards, acting like dangerous shrapnel. Leftover dark red wine splashed heavily across the hem of the thick charcoal wool fabric, soaking quickly into the dark material like fresh, warm blood. It was a petty, incredibly vicious, highly calculated attempt to force a volatile emotional reaction, a desperate maneuver to finally extract the weeping and screaming that the public ceremony had so embarrassingly failed to produce. The quiet Omega paused her diligent scrubbing. She did not flinch when the sharp shards struck the heavy protective fabric of her skirt. She did not gasp in shock, and she absolutely did not look up at the sneering, triumphant figure towering aggressively over her small, hunched frame. Instead, she calmly reached her bare, freezing hand out into the chaotic mess. She began picking up the broken, wine-soaked pieces of debris one by one. Her slender fingers moved with a steady, unshaken, terrifying grace that bordered on the divine. The jagged edges of the broken plates dug painfully into her skin, but she welcomed the grounding physical sting. Even the most shattered soul possesses an innate, undeniable value. Beneath the intricate high-buttoned fabric at her neck, the hidden claiming mark flared instantly with a ferocious, highly protective heat. The ancient sentient magic immediately recognized the blatant disrespect being directed at its chosen vessel. The golden thread pulsed rapidly against her collarbone, sending a sudden massive wave of absolute searing power through her tired veins. The intense physiological reaction made the freezing, drafty air around her suddenly feel like a sweltering, unbearable summer noon. She collected the shattered plates in complete, eerie silence, piling them neatly into her wooden bucket. Her breathing remained perfectly even. Her heart beat with a slow, immensely powerful rhythm that had absolutely nothing to do with the petty, insignificant squabbles of a regional pack, knowing with absolute, unshakable certainty that the true, terrifying sovereign of the realm was already rapidly riding his way through the dark night to balance the scales. The bucket groaned under the heavy weight of shattered porcelain as Sienna carried it down the jagged stone staircase. The darkness of the servant levels offered no sanctuary from the booming laughter of the pack celebrating above. It offered only a suffocating silence, broken periodically by the rhythmic hollow drip of freezing water from the vaulted ceiling. The air down here smelled of damp earth, decaying roots, and harsh lye. She set the heavy burden onto the uneven flagstones. The broken plates clinked together, a pathetic sound that echoed in the gloom. She dipped her bare, trembling hands into the crude stone wash basin. The ice water stung her knuckles. The harsh soap burned the small cuts on her palms. She washed the dirt from her skin with methodical precision. This public humiliation was intended to shatter her spirit. That is what Raymond had believed. That is what the entire Wintervale pack had expected. Hundreds had gathered in the great hall beneath the ancient banners, holding their breath to watch an Omega crumble. Everyone expected her to weep, to fall to her knees, to beg for a reason why she was not enough. She did none of those things. Beneath the frayed collar of her servant dress, the sovereign mark pulsed, a steady rhythmic beat of pure golden fire. The heat chased away the biting chill of the cellar, wrapping her in an invisible cloak of protection. It anchored her. Leather scuffed abruptly against whetstone. She did not turn her head. She did not need to. The cloying scent of winter pine, mixed with the sour stench of nervous sweat, flooded the narrow corridor. Raymond stepped from the shadows. The newly crowned husband had abandoned his own grand feast. He came down into the dark to seek out the one person whose absolute ruin he desperately needed to witness. His jaw was clenched so tight the bone looked ready to snap. A muscle twitched violently beneath his pale skin. He marched toward her, his heavy boots splashing through the puddles of dirty water. He cornered her against the stone basin. He planted both of his large hands on the freezing masonry beside her delicate shoulders, trapping her, looming over her. He wanted her to bow. He needed the weeping submission she had so calmly denied him upstairs. "You think this is a game?" Raymond hissed. His chest heaved with uneven, frantic breaths. "You think standing there and smiling makes you look strong? It makes you look pathetic." Sienna slowly raised her chin. She looked up at him. Her pale, storm-colored gaze was completely empty of the adoration that had once fed his fragile ego. The blind devotion of a fated mate was gone, burned away by his public betrayal. She looked at him like he was a stranger blocking her path. Nothing more. "I had to do it," he snarled, leaning his face so close she could feel the heat of his anger. He stepped closer. He needed to provoke a reaction. Any reaction. Caring about you was killing me. You were a liability to this territory. I could not tie my bloodline to a wolfless ghost. She refused to offer him a single tear. Her chest rose and fell in a calm, steady rhythm. Her total indifference felt like a blade twisting in his gut. His face twisted into a mask of ugly, desperate defense. A mistake is when you do not know what you are doing. A choice is when you do. And you do it anyway, Raymond whispered, his voice trembling with a mixture of rage and guilt he could not suppress. I chose her. I chose Clara. I chose power, political alliances, and a Luna who actually commands respect. You are nothing now, Sienna. You will rot down here in the dark until you forget your own name. He expected her to break. He needed her to shatter into a million irreparable pieces. She merely blinked. A pitying, terribly quiet smile touched her pale lips. He stood there, puffing out his chest, boasting about ruling a crumbling stone fortress in the middle of a frozen wasteland. He did, Clear's throat, not know. He did not know the true sovereign of the realm had already marked her flesh. He was entirely oblivious to the fact that she had been claimed as an equal by the most powerful man alive. The mark flared in response to her thought. A massive wave of blistering heat rushed through her veins, a fire that tasted of ancient magic and absolute authority. The damp, freezing cellar suddenly felt as warm as a sunlit courtyard in the height of summer. She remained completely silent. Her unbroken dignity, her absolute refusal to play the victim, drove him to the edge of blind fury. He raised his hand. His thick knuckles popped in the quiet damp. His fingers curled tightly into a fist. He was a fraction of a breath away from grabbing her jaw, from forcing her to look upon the alpha who had discarded her. Then, the world ended. It began as a low, terrifying vibration deep in the bedrock beneath their feet. The blast of the royal horn tore through the raging blizzard outside. It struck the stone fortress with the devastating force of a physical battering ram. The singular deafening note climbed higher and higher. It shattered the massive icicles hanging from the battlements. The ancient foundation of the pack house groaned in agony. Dust and loose mortar rained down from the vaulted ceiling in thick sheets. The freezing water in the stone basin rippled violently. It splashed over the jagged edges and soaked the hem of her skirt. Rats scrambled frantically from the dark corners, squeaking in terror as they fled deeper into the earth. A sound not heard in this isolated province in 300 long years. Raymond froze. His raised fist dropped lifelessly to his side. Every drop of color drained instantly from his face. His skin turned the sickening ashen hue of a corpse. The petty, arrogant rage in his eyes vanished entirely. Primal, absolute terror took its place. A regional leader was a god only until the true king visited, Clear's throat, his territory. He staggered backward, his boots slipping on the slick stones. He completely forgot the outcast he had just cornered. He turned and sprinted blindly toward the stone stairs. His boots stumbled and scraped on the uneven steps in his frantic, desperate rush to reach the courtyard. He breathed in ragged, pathetic gasps. He looked exactly like a man trying to outrun a deadly avalanche that was already swallowing him whole. Sienna did not run. She turned slowly. She moved toward the small, iron-barred window, set high in the thick cellar wall. The glass was completely coated in a solid layer of white frost. She raised her hand, her slender fingertips pressed gently against the freezing pane. The unnatural, scorching heat of her royal blood melted the solid ice in mere seconds. It cleared a perfect circular portal into the violent night. Through the swirling white chaos of the blizzard, a blinding light pierced the darkness. A massive, armored carriage rolled smoothly through the shattered iron gates of the pack house. It was flanked by dozens of elite guards draped in the heavy black cloaks and gleaming silver armor. The monstrous, terrifying war beasts pulling the massive vehicle did not struggle against the deep snow. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace. The sheer display of ancient, unfathomable power made the Wintervale fortress look like a pathetic pile of dirt and twigs. The burn on her collarbone became a raging inferno that stole her breath. He had found her. Up in the frozen courtyard, the heavy oak doors of the great hall burst open. Drunken pack leaders and terrified nobles spilled out into the raging storm. Raymond sprinted frantically into the icy mire. He lost his footing instantly. He stumbled blindly in the deep snow, falling to his knees in the mud. Clara followed closely behind him. She shrieked in panic as she tripped over the heavy hem of her custom gown. The pristine white silk dragged heavily through the dark mud, ruined in an instant. The vicious winter wind whipped her perfectly styled blonde hair into a frantic, tangled mess. Elder Corvin hobbled desperately after the newly mated pair. His sacred ceremonial staff lay abandoned and forgotten on the hall floorboards. The old priest was hyperventilating. His fragile chest hitched violently as his weak heart struggled to handle the terrifying reality unfolding before his fading eyes. They scrambled pathetically toward the center of the wet, freezing courtyard. They were instantly surrounded by the towering, silent figures of the elite royal guard. Near the front of the intimidating formation, Gerald Frost slowly lowered the silver-trimmed royal horn from his lips. The herald sat absolutely motionless atop his massive war mount. He looked down at the trembling local leaders with an expression of cold, unyielding disgust. The massive black carriage rolled to a heavy final stop. The raging storm simply held its breath. The howling, violent wind died instantly. It was forced into absolute submission by the crushing, suffocating pressure radiating from the iron vehicle. The heavy door swung open. It creaked loudly, sounding exactly like a heavy stone coffin lid being pried apart in a silent graveyard. A heavy black boot stepped down into the chilled earth. High King Valerius Sterling emerged slowly from the dark shadows of the cabin. He did not wear a crown. He did not need to. He wore the terrifying, absolute aura of a god of war. His broad silver-armored shoulders seemed to block out the very night sky. The heavy black fur-lined cloak draped over his back seemed to absorb the flickering torchlight. It cast a massive, terrifying shadow across the entirely frozen courtyard. The sheer physical weight of his arrival slammed into the Wintervale pack like a solid wall of iron. Raymond's knees hit the jagged, frozen rocks with a sickening crack. He threw his upper body forward without a second of hesitation. He pressed his face directly into the freezing mud. He trembled so violently his teeth chattered audibly against the wet earth. Beside him, the arrogant new Luna collapsed completely into the frozen puddles. Her ruined silk dress soaked up the freezing water. It clung to her shivering skin like lead weights. She pressed her forehead flat against the ground, weeping openly as the brutal cold bit into her exposed skin. The old priest threw his frail body flat into the snow. He prayed silently and desperately to ancestors who had suddenly, conveniently gone deaf. The entire hierarchy of the territory was instantly reduced to insignificant insects. They were crushed effortlessly beneath the heavy boots of true, unquestionable power. Valerius did not look down at them. He completely ignored the pathetic Alpha and his shivering bride. His blazing golden irises swept slowly over the dark, crumbling stone walls of the pack house. He visually tore the structure apart piece by piece. He was not there to acknowledge a meaningless regional pack. He was there for the steady, calm heartbeat answering the undeniable call of his soul from the dark, freezing cellars below. Raymond pressed his face deeper into the freezing slush. He choked on mouthfuls of icy mud, desperate to appease the towering figure looming above him in the violent storm. The bitter cold of the wet earth seeped completely through his ceremonial trousers, freezing the skin of his knees. He did not care. Survival instinct, raw and purely animalistic, completely overrode his arrogant pride. His lungs burned as he forced air through his chattering teeth. He dared to lift his eyes just enough to see the hem of the High King's dark cloak, a heavy velvet that seemed to swallow the ambient light. The snowflakes did not dare settle on the monarch's shoulders. They melted instantly, vaporized by the sheer blistering heat of his terrifying aura. "Your Majesty," the regional leader stammered. His voice cracked horribly in the unnatural silence of the courtyard. The wind had died. The entire pack held their breath. Raymond kept his forehead glued to the jagged cobblestones, his mind racing to find a way to survive this encounter. "Wintervale is deeply honored. My territory, my pack, is yours to command. Whatever you require, whoever you require, it is yours." Valerius did not even blink. The monarch stepped past the groveling man as if stepping over a rotting, insignificant branch on the forest path. The heavy iron links of the royal armor clinked softly. It was a deadly, rhythmic sound that promised absolute destruction. "Where is she?" The High King's voice was a low, terrifying rumble. It vibrated directly through the ancient bedrock of the mountain. It rattled the frozen branches of the whispering woods. It was not a question. It was a divine command that demanded immediate, total obedience. Raymond scrambled frantically to his hands and knees. He looked up, his pale face smeared with dark dirt and melting snow. His chest he heaved with ragged breaths. A sickening realization dawned rapidly in his panicked mind, quickly twisting into a cruel, desperate relief. He meant Sienna. The king had been attacked in these very woods 3 weeks ago. He assumed the outcast had somehow offended the crown during her brief time scavenging in the snow. He assumed the sovereign had ridden through the blizzard to personally execute a traitor. "The worthless Omega!" the local alpha gasped, eager to distance himself from her entirely. He pointed a trembling, mud-stained finger toward the dark, narrow stairwell of the servant quarters. "She is in the cellar, my king. She," Clear's throat, "is a blight. I have already stripped her of all rank. She is nothing to us. You may have her head." Valerius slowly turned his massive head. His molten gold eyes locked instantly onto the pathetic, shivering man. The sheer killing intent radiating from the royal aura expanded outward like a physical shockwave. The freezing air turned to glass in their lungs. Behind the king, Gerald Frost and the surrounding elite guards simultaneously rested their thick gauntlets on the hilts of their broadswords. The sharp sound of steel leaving leather echoed through the courtyard. They were waiting for a single nod to slaughter the entire territory, to burn Winterfell to the ground. He did not give the order. He had infinitely more important matters to attend to. The sovereign turned away. He descended into the dark. The heavy, rhythmic thud of his armored boots echoed loudly down the jagged stone steps. Far below in the subterranean gloom, Sienna stood perfectly still beside the crude wash basin. The deafening silence of the terrified pack above pressed heavily against the vaulted, cracked ceiling. The harsh lye soap still stung the small cuts on her hands. The freezing water in the basin was turning a dull pink from her bleeding knuckles, ruined by scrubbing the very plates Clara had shattered at her feet hours earlier. She heard the footsteps, heavy, deliberate, not the hurried, arrogant stomp of Raymond, not the light, cruel patter of Clara. This was the march of a conqueror. She did not attempt to dry her hands. She did not lower her chin. She did not tremble. The massive shadow of the monarch stepped into the dim light. He stopped mere inches from her. The potent fragrance of crushed evergreen, copper, and violent blizzards instantly swallowed the harsh stench of decay and mold. Valerius looked down at her frayed, wet servant dress. His gaze dragged over the dirty water soaking the hem of her skirt, the bruised skin around her wrists, the cracked, bleeding knuckles. His strong jaw clenched so tightly the bone audibly popped. A terrifying guttural growl vibrated deep within his broad chest. It was a sound of primal outrage, a promise of absolute ruin to whoever had dared to place his fated soul in this dark, miserable dungeon. He reached out. His large, heavily scarred hand was remarkably gentle. The contrast between the lethal violence in his eyes and the feather-like touch of his calloused fingers stole the breath from her lungs. He brushed softly against the edge of her embroidered neckline. The physical contact sent a violent, beautiful shockwave of heat straight down to her very bones, chasing away the bone-deep chill of the cellar. He pulled the worn fabric aside. The sovereign mark erupted. A blinding, magnificent golden light flooded the miserable cellar. It was not merely a glow. It was a physical manifestation of ancient god-tier magic. The brilliant illumination spilled rapidly up the narrow stairway, bursting out into the freezing courtyard like a rising sun. The undeniable divine heat of the royal claim slammed directly into the Wintervale pack. It hit them with the devastating force of a physical blow. The magic forced every single shifter outside to press their faces completely flat against the icy cobblestones. Their bodies were literally crushed against the earth by the overwhelming weight of their true chosen ruler. The ice beneath them hissed and melted, turning the courtyard into a steaming pool of mud. Up in the slush, Raymond choked on a sob of absolute horror. The golden light reflected in the puddles around his face, blinding him with its holy radiance. He stared at the glowing cellar door. He realized in one agonizing, reality-shattering heartbeat exactly what he had thrown away. The girl he had discarded for a few political alliances, the quiet servant he had banished to the dark, was the highest authority in the known world. She was the High Queen, and he had just told her mate to take her head. Down in the cellar, Valerius unclasped the heavy black fur-lined cloak from his own broad shoulders. He wrapped the massive garment carefully around her trembling, freezing frame. The thick velvet swallowed her completely, trapping his blistering, protective heat against her cold skin. The scent of pine and sovereign power wrapped around her like an impenetrable fortress. "There is no wolf too broken to be worthy," the king whispered into the quiet dark. His golden eyes were filled with a fierce, unwavering devotion. "And there is no kingdom I will not burn to keep you safe." He lifted her effortlessly into his strong arms. Sienna rested her head against his cold silver armor. She listened intently to the steady, powerful thrum of his heart. The emotional fortress she had constructed to survive the years of neglect simply vanished. The sovereign carried her up the steep stone steps and out into the violent, swirling blizzard. The entire pack remained securely pinned to the wet earth, paralyzed by the divine authority radiating from the glowing collarbone of the quiet outcast. Clara lay sobbing hysterically in her ruined silk gown. The bitter cold bit into her exposed skin, ruining her moment of triumph. Her face was buried in the mud, the stolen lunar ring completely ignored and meaningless on her shaking finger. It looked like a cheap, dull trinket beneath the blinding sun of the sovereign mark. Elder Corvin whimpered a final useless prayer into the dirt, realizing his rigid traditions had just doomed them all to ash. Raymond dragged his broken body forward. His fingernails tore and bled against the frozen rocks. He crawled through the freezing slush, completely abandoning whatever shreds of dignity he had left. His alpha pride was shattered, pulverized into nothingness by the crushing weight of the High King's dominance. Sienna, please," the broken man screamed. His voice was completely raw with a desperate, pathetic agony. "Please, I was wrong. Forgive me. I didn't know." He reached out a muddy, trembling hand toward the golden carriage waiting beyond the iron gates. He watched her leave like a man watching his own heart walk out of his chest. Sienna did not look back. She did not turn her head to acknowledge his suffering. She did clear his throat, not offer him a single word of comfort, nor a sliver of her justified anger. She simply let the warm, luxurious darkness of the royal cabin swallow her. Claimed not as property, but as an irreplaceable equal, she sat completely still as the heavy iron door slammed shut, sealing her new fate. The massive war beasts lunged forward, their heavy hooves tearing up the mud as they pulled the carriage out of the shattered gates. She left the crumbling, pathetic ruins of Wintervale behind in the unforgiving snow. The rejection ceremony was supposed to break her. Instead, it had crowned her. The ancient hollow fortress still stands in the frozen north. They say it is haunted now, though not by the dead. It is haunted by the agonizing memory of a single night when an arrogant leader threw away a quiet servant only to watch a terrifying king kneel for a queen. Thank you for listening to this story. If the warmth of this tale reached you, please leave a like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments, would you have walked away as silently as she did? I read every single one, and your words mean more than you know. Until next time.